I want you to think about a specific moment in your life. Have you ever completely ruined something you deeply, desperately desired simply because you tried way too hard to control exactly how it happened?
Oh, that is such a familiar feeling.
Right. You had this perfect picture in your head. You gripped the steering wheel as tight as you possibly could to ensure you hit every single milestone perfectly, and somehow the whole thing just veered right off a cliff.
Yeah, we've all been there.
Well, welcome to today's deep dive. We are exploring a really fascinating text today called The Divine Trade-Off, and our mission for this deep dive is to investigate a profound and arguably very uncomfortable concept.
Highly uncomfortable.
Exactly. We're looking at the idea of surrendering our rigid, step-by-step life plans. We're examining what happens when we exchange our intense need for executive control for what the author describes as divine timing in nature.
And it's a universal struggle, especially in a culture that rewards hyper-optimization and constant planning. The core theme we're going to examine today is why human beings naturally want to force the process of their goals.
We want what we want right when we want it.
Exactly. We want it immediately and strictly on our terms.
Mm.
But the text proposes that letting go, actually entering into this trade-off yields a result that is infinitely richer than whatever we were trying to micromanage into existence.
Okay.
Essentially, we are looking at the underlying mechanics of surrender.
Okay, let's unpack this because the author uses an incredibly modern, relatable example to kick things off. They talk about the process of starting a YouTube channel.
Yes, the creator economy example.
Right. So imagine you decide you want to be a creator, you do all the research, you watch countless tutorials on how to build successful content,
You memorize all the SEO keywords.
you memorize the keywords, you pick the absolute perfect aesthetic backdrop, you buy the high-end recording equipment, you brand everything flawlessly, and you do all of this because you have convinced yourself that the specific path you researched is the absolute, undeniable law of how to get the result you want.
which is a fundamental flaw in how we process information. The text points out a simple mathematical reality here. If there are countless ways to succeed, and if new disruptive ways are constantly being invented every single day, then logically, the heavily researched path you've chosen isn't necessarily the only way.
It's just one way.
Right. It might not even be the right way for your specific disposition or your specific talents. But we lock ourselves into these theoretical boxes. We tell ourselves that because we saw someone else achieve it using a specific blueprint, or because we visualized it playing out a certain way, any deviation from that script is a failure.
That blueprint mentality perfectly mirrors how we view our own long-term futures. The author brings up this metaphor of an Avengers movie.
I love this part.
It's so good. So an Avengers movie is roughly 3 hours long, and when you're sitting in the theater, it feels like a massive, epic chunk of time. You go through entire eras with these characters. But the author compares that 3-hour movie to the vision you have for your life.
It's a brilliant framing device. Because the 3-hour movie feels incredibly long in the moment. But if you step back and look at the actual span of a human life, 3 hours is just a split second.
Yeah, a tiny fraction.
And that is exactly what our visions for our future are. They're just split-second previews. They show you a flash of a destination, maybe a highlight reel of the success you want.
But they skip over a lot.
They omit everything. What they absolutely do not show you are the details. They skip the messy in-betweens, the mundane waiting periods, the failures. They don't show you the doors that have to slam shut in your face for others to open. Making rigid, sweeping executive decisions based on a split-second preview is fundamentally unwise because you are acting on severely incomplete data.
You're essentially trying to direct a documentary based on a 30-second teaser trailer.
Exactly.
Which leads to this concept the author introduces called the divine shutoff. And they mean this quite literally. To get to where you're going, the text argues you sometimes have to execute a divine shutoff. You have to shut off your brain.
Shut off your mouth.
Shut off your mouth. Shut off that endless internal pondering. And most importantly, shut off your overruling desires. Those impulses where you try to control every single variable because you want the outcome so badly. But I have to push back here for a second.
Yeah.
In a world built on proactive hustle, doesn't a divine shutoff just sound like a recipe for complacency? Like, how does the author differentiate between surrendering to divine timing and just being passive and missing your window of opportunity?
That is the exact friction the author anticipates.
Yeah.
The distinction really lies in what you're actually shutting off.
Yeah.
You aren't shutting off your work ethic. You aren't shutting off your daily actions. You are shutting off your obsessive need to overrule the process.
Overruling the process, right.
The text argues that our obsessive overruling actually ruins the very thing we desire, because we squeeze the life out of it by not letting it breathe. Active surrender isn't about sitting on the couch doing nothing. It's about doing the work, and then having the discipline to step back and let the unquantifiable variables do theirs.
To ground that abstract idea, the author pivots to a central, recurring metaphor that flows through the whole text. And it's a home-cooked meal. I want you to think about that person in your life whose cooking always comes out perfectly, every single time, without fail.
The intuitive master cook. We all know someone who operates exactly like this in a kitchen.
Oh, absolutely. And if you watch them, they are not using a quarter teaspoon to measure their spices. They aren't meticulously leveling off cups of flour.
Never.
The text describes how they just keep seasoning until it feels right. They are in the kitchen, shaking spices to the rhythm of a melody in their head that they discovered years ago. They know exactly how much milk to pour, not because a cookbook dictated it, but based on mistakes they made from past batches.
Yes, muscle memory.
Right. They stop right before the limit because their muscle memory remembers what happened last time it went wrong.
What's fascinating here is the psychological aspect of this kind of mastery. When you ask this master cook for their recipe, they might try to explain it to you. But to an outsider, it just sounds like scrambled eggs in the mind.
It makes no logical sense.
It completely defies logical, linear sense. Their process relies heavily on faith, belief, and an intuition that they've drawn from totally different parts of their life experience. It's not a strict list of measurements. It's an energetic harmony.
An energetic harmony, I like that.
It takes pieces that seem arbitrary or meaningless to an observer and weaves them into something structurally perfect.
And the author paints this vivid, almost cinematic picture to drive this home. Imagine you are sitting in the kitchen with God, or the divine, the universe, however you frame that higher power in your own life. We're sitting there asking for the recipe to make the vision of your life happen. You eagerly take out a pen and a piece of paper, ready to write down the exact formula so you can go execute it.
And the author's directive here is blunt. Put the pen down.
Yeah? Put the pencil down, put the paper pad down.
Because there is no formula to write down in the way our rational minds expect to receive one. You aren't going to get a step-by-step checklist. You are going to have to rely on your spirit and your intuition.
You have to feel it out.
You have to stop pouring the milk when your intuition tells you to stop, not when the measuring cup hits half a cup. The trade-off is trading your reliance on a rigid, earthly recipe for a divine, intuitive process.
But that is terrifying for a lot of people. Dropping the pen means relinquishing the illusion of safety that a checklist provides.
Completely.
And a huge part of surviving that transition, according to the text, is understanding the profound difference between steps and markers. In any process, there are specific markers you have to hit. The examples the author gives are so visceral. Think about barbecue meat marinating in its own juices, or cheese sitting in a controlled environment to intentionally go sour, or wine sitting in a barrel to refine its taste over years.
Notice what all of those examples have in common. They're all processes of profound transformation that require time as the primary, irreplaceable ingredient.
You can't rush it.
You cannot hack fermentation. You cannot optimize marination. The waiting itself is the active ingredient.
But our modern brains are practically allergic to waiting. The author uses this incredibly relatable analogy of meal prepping to explain our modern impatience.
The microwave trap.
Yes, you take the time, you do the hard work of cooking a beautiful fresh meal from scratch, but the very next day when you want to eat the leftovers, you want it fast. You don't want to wait. You just want to throw it in the microwave.
This is where the author introduces a genuinely challenging concept: spiritual laziness. We have this pervasive tendency to think that just because we did the initial hard work, we cooked the fresh meal, we sowed the seeds, we reaped the initial harvest, that all the heavy lifting is completely over.
We feel entitled to the result.
We do. We demand the quick microwave version of our goals because we feel entitled to the result after completing step one.
Now, I can hear people getting defensive at that term. If someone put in the grueling hours to cook a complex meal from scratch, why is it lazy to just want to eat it the next day without another production? Why is efficiency being framed as a spiritual failing?
It's a fair question. But the text frames it around the degradation of quality. The laziness isn't in the lack of physical effort. It's in the unwillingness to endure the final, crucial phase of the process. If you demand it quickly through the microwave, you are actively settling for an okay meal.
You're sacrificing the quality.
You're compromising the quality of your own harvest just to shave off a few minutes. The author contrasts this with the oven reward. What happens if you take an extra 5 to 10 minutes to preheat the oven, put the food in an oven-safe container, and let it reheat properly?
The food returns to its original state.
Or, as the text points out, it actually tastes better because it was allowed to slowly warm up in its own juices. You're trading 5 minutes of instant gratification for a vastly superior experience.
The author uses a specific detail about a wheat harvest to really hammer this point home. If you put in the grueling, back-breaking labor to harvest an entire field of wheat, why would you immediately use it to make the quickest, worst possible version of food just because you're hungry right now?
Right. Why stop there?
Why wouldn't you take the time to refine it, to make something much better, like cereal or cream of wheat? Why rush the final product when you've already invested so much of your life into the raw materials? Think about a project you were working on right now. Are you trying to microwave a harvest you spent years growing?
It's a tragic waste of potential. And this entire philosophy of patience, timing, and unseen transformation gets expanded into the most elaborate metaphor in the text: the process of making a New York-style pizza.
Let's walk through this because it's brilliant. The first marker is making the dough. You knead it, you get the consistency right, and then you have to put it in the fridge to let it sit.
And we have to emphasize what is actually happening in that fridge. It's not merely resting or getting cold. The author highlights that this resting period is a literal, profound chemical reaction.
It's changing entirely.
Once that dough undergoes that cold fermentation, it can never ever return to its original state. It's a completely new entity. But just because you have successfully created this new chemically transformed dough, it absolutely does not mean you have a pizza yet.
You have the ingredients, you hit the first marker, but you don't have the vision yet. So you have this bare crust, and before the tomato sauce, the cheese, the seasonings, before any of the toppings that make it look like a pizza go on, that bare crust has to go into a preheating fire just to take its shape.
The fire is necessary.
But before it steps into that heat, something essential has to happen. It must be covered in olive oil.
Yes.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The text spends a significant amount of time on this specific detail. The author describes taking the raw crust, brushing it with olive oil, sending it into the oven, taking it out, applying even more oil before the toppings go on, and then applying oil again after the finished pizza comes out of the oven. Why the obsession with the oil?
The symbolism here is incredibly dense. The oil in this context represents divine protection, preparation, and coverage. The text stresses that you simply cannot send raw, vulnerable elements into the fire without that protective layer.
She needs that armor.
If you send that bare crust into the searing heat without the olive oil, the result is exactly what you'd expect. It gets burnt up. It comes out incredibly hard, crispy, and essentially ruined.
If we translate that metaphor to our lives, it sounds like the author is warning us about the dangers of stepping into high-pressure situations, the fire of our ambitions, without adequate internal preparation. If you force your way into the heat before you're protected, you don't emerge refined. You emerge burnt out and brittle.
Precisely. The oil is what allows the dough to endure the refining fire without being destroyed by it. It facilitates the shaping process. But the discipline doesn't end when the pizza finally looks like the vision and comes out of the oven.
Right. The author gives this huge, almost comical warning about the danger of taking that beautiful, finished pizza straight out of the hot oven and immediately biting into it. If you revert back to being that microwave-type person we talked about, if you demand to consume the reward the very second it visually looks finished, you are going to pay a heavy price.
The text points out the very real biological consequence of that specific impatience. You will severely burn your tongue.
Ouch. Yeah.
And the tragic irony of burning your tongue is that you make it so intensely sensitive that you literally cannot taste anything else after that.
Yeah.
Take another bite and you taste nothing. You go to eat something else later and you taste nothing. You have successfully ruined your own capacity to enjoy the meal you spent all this time creating simply because you couldn't wait a few more minutes for it to cool down to a safe temperature.
The meal has to be ingestible to be digestible. That line from the text stopped me in my tracks.
It's the thesis statement of the entire metaphor. A goal or a blessing has to reach a state where you can actually consume it without it causing you harm. That cooling period, that final waiting room, is its own distinct non-negotiable marker in the process.
The meal has to be ingestible to be digestible. I want you to really sit with that. Have you ever finally achieved something you've worked years for, but you forced it to happen so abruptly or you grabbed onto it so aggressively that the stress of it completely ruined your ability to actually enjoy it?
You win, but you lose.
You got the promotion, but you burned your tongue on it, and now the victory tastes like ash. That is exactly why we have to surrender to a timeline we didn't engineer. Which brings us to the final major concept the author explores: the profound difference between knowing how a process works and knowing why it was created that way in the first place. The author brings up the analogy of a scientist or a doctor.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, a highly educated scientist can explain to you the exact mechanical recipe for the natural world. They can tell you exactly why the sky appears blue by explaining Rayleigh scattering. They can explain the chemical reasons why chlorophyll makes grass green, or the physics behind why a car's paint reflects a specific wavelength of color to our retinas. They've completely memorized the recipe.
They know the mechanics of it perfectly. They hold the blueprint.
But the text draws a hard philosophical line between human understanding and divine wisdom. Human understanding can tell you the chemical process of caramelizing onions versus sautéing onions. We can track the Maillard reaction down to the molecule. But only the ultimate architect of the process knows why that specific, deeply complex chemical reaction was created to yield that specific delicious result in the first place. Why does time and low heat equal caramelization? A scientist can track the molecular change, but the foundational reason for that design is beyond human scope.
And when we forget that distinction, when we arrogantly think our human understanding of the recipe means we can bypass or hack the designer's process, we get into serious trouble. We suffer from what the author calls executive dysfunction. And I want to clarify here, the author isn't using this in the clinical sense, like the medical term associated with ADHD or neurodivergence. They are using it purely as a metaphor for overstepping our role. We try to executively function over a deeply complex universe that we only understand a microscopic fraction of.
We assume the role of the executive when we're merely the ingredients. Because we only see the mechanics and not the underlying why, we rush. We turn the heat up too high on the stove because we think more heat equals faster results. We try to force the timeline, and we end up mistaking sautéed onions for caramelized ones. We think we've arrived at the vision, but something deep down just tastes wrong. It lacks the depth of the authentic process.
The ultimate trade-off the text is demanding from us is precisely this surrender. We have to trade our incredibly limited split-second, 3-hour movie vision of our lives for the divine order. We have to admit, with humility, that we only see a tiny fragment of the whole picture. We have to surrender our desperate need to control the recipe, step away from the microwave, and trust the slow, transformative heat of the oven.
It requires a massive relinquishing of ego. You have to trust that the process knows what it's doing with you, even when you are sitting in the dark of the fridge, chemically changing, wondering when you'll ever see the fire.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want you to really look at your own life right now. Think about the visions and the goals you are carrying with you today. Are you standing in your kitchen, staring at a pile of raw ingredients and getting deeply, inherently angry that it's not a 5-star, fully plated meal yet? Are you constantly trying to microwave a process that desperately needs the time to marinate, to chemically alter, and to slowly bake in the oven? It might be time to put the pen down.
We spent this entire time exploring the necessity of surrendering the recipe, putting down the pen, and trusting the heat of the oven. But looking at the source material, it raises an important question for you to mull over as you go about your day. How do you actually learn to recognize the melody of your own intuition? That internal, energetic rhythm the master cook relies on when the kitchen of your daily life is completely filled with the noisy, chaotic demands of everyone else's recipes.
That is an incredible thought to leave on. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive and taking the time to explore the mechanics of surrender with us. We will catch you on the next one.